The silence in the town of Black Hollow, Maine, has always been different. Thick, charged, as if something was waiting to reveal itself. I'm an investigative journalist, and I've spent years covering stories about small towns and their bizarre legends. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found here. It all started when I heard about the fog. Locals said that every night, just after midnight, a thick fog would cover the town. It wasn't just any fog. It was something thicker, as if the air itself was turning solid, and within it, there were shadows. No one left their homes after dark. Doors and windows were locked. Even the streetlights were turned off. "Darkness hides, but light attracts attention," said a woman at the grocery store, refusing to say anything more. On my second night in town, I decided to stay outside. I wanted to see for myself. At 12:01 a.m., the fog rolled in. Out of nowhere, it flowed through the streets like a river, slow and dense, erasing everything around it. The smell was of rotten sea. My eyes began to burn. My heart beat fast. And then, I heard it. Footsteps, heavy but not human, dragging, slow. I hid behind an abandoned car. I held my breath. That was when I saw the silhouettes. They were people, but something about them was wrong. They walked together, covered in fog, all wearing dark robes. Their faces were indistinct, as if the fog itself hid them. They were carrying something, a body. Fear froze me. The thing they were carrying struggled weakly, suffocated by the fog. Then, one of them stopped. It turned its head slowly to the side, directly to where I was. "He's watching." The voice didn't come from a mouth. It came from the air itself. The mist began to move toward me. Something was coming, something I couldn't see. My entire body screamed to run, but when I turned to flee, the mist had already closed all the exits. The fog closed in around me, suffocating, thick as smoke, but moist as something alive. The smell of rotten sea was stronger. My eyes stung. My lungs began to burn. The footsteps continued, but now they weren't just the cultists. There was something else, something bigger. In the midst of the fog, tall shadows moved erratically, as if they were trying to form. Long, thin arms appeared for an instant, only to disappear back into the darkness. Then I heard that voice again. "He sees. He must be taken." It didn't come from a mouth. It came from all sides. Fear drove me. I ran. My feet kicked at the fog, but it didn't dissipate. Instead, it seemed to thicken. The city around me began to change. The houses, once so normal, looked different. The doors looked older. The windows were broken. The streetlights flickered like dying candles. I looked back and saw the figures moving. They were moving faster now. The cult was hunting me. My lungs screamed for fresh air, but the rotten smell of the fog took over everything. I turned a corner and saw something that made me stop abruptly. A chasm. The street ended in a dark void, where the fog poured like a waterfall into nothingness. The entire city was suspended over something impossible. "There is no way out," the voice whispered again, and this time, it was right behind me. I turned and saw the entire cult standing a few feet away. The faces were still shadows, but now, in the middle of the group, there was something different. A tall figure, much taller than any human. I couldn't see his face, only a flowing black robe, and where his eyes should have been, there was only a bright void. My entire body froze. The figure raised a long arm, and the mist moved with it, as if it were part of his flesh. "You belong to the mist now." My mind screamed to run, but my feet were glued to the ground. Then, the figure pointed a skeletal finger at me. The mist exploded around me. I was falling. The last thing I saw was the cult watching from above, their dark faces expressionless. And before the abyss swallowed me, 100 arms reached out from the mist to grab me. Then, everything went black. I woke up in the middle of the street. The sun was shining. The city was normal. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it all, but when I looked at my arms, There were finger marks on my body, as if something had held me down, and in the distance, at the end of the street, the fog was still there, waiting for me, because now I belonged to it too. Dreamland Park was supposed to be the biggest amusement park in California, with state-of-the-art rides, a huge carousel, and the tallest roller coaster in the state. It promised to be a runaway success, but it never opened. Construction was halted abruptly in the 1980s. Workers were laid off without warning. Some say the park closed due to financial problems. Others say it was something much worse. I'm an urban explorer. I've broken into abandoned factories, run-down hotels, and even forgotten mental hospitals. But nothing prepared me for what I found at Dreamland Park. I arrived at the park around midnight. The park was tucked away from the city, hidden by hills and gnarled trees. The entrance gate was locked with rusty chains, and the no trespassing signs were weathered with age. I climbed over the fence. The air was still, thick. The smell of rust, mixed with something sweet, too sweet, sent a shiver down my spine. I walked through the park. Everything seemed frozen in time. The roller coaster cars sat on the tracks, covered in dust. The carousel was still, its horses with peeling paint and cracked eyes. It was completely silent, until I heard a sound, a faint tinkling, like bells ringing in the wind. I turned quickly, sweeping the flashlight around. Nothing, just darkness and motionless rides. Then something caught my eye on the ground. Footprints. They were recent, very recent. I followed the marks, which led toward the House of Mirrors. The building was a maze of cracked glass and stained walls. A dim light bulb flickered inside. I gritted my teeth. My heart was pounding. That was when the music started. The carousel was spinning. I turned around suddenly. The colored lights flashed. The horses slowly rose and fell. The park had been abandoned for decades. This was impossible. Then I saw it. In the middle of the carousel, a shadow sat on one of the horses. It was thin, too slender to be human. Its head was tilted, as if it were watching me. The lights flashed faster. My muscles locked. The carousel spun, and the shadow began to move. It slowly turned toward me. The light went out for a second, and when it came back on, the shadow was gone. But the sound of footsteps began to echo through the park, and they were coming straight toward me. The footsteps were getting closer, slow, shuffling, as if something was hunting me. My heart was pounding. The flashlight was shaking in my hand. The carousel was still spinning on its own, its lights flashing like a heart about to fail. The music was distorted, as if it were playing underwater. The shadow had disappeared, but I knew it was still there. I took a deep breath and took a step back. The ground beneath my feet felt colder. The wind stopped. The entire park suddenly went silent. Then the music stopped. The silence was even worse. I swallowed hard. I turned slowly and ran in the opposite direction. I had to get out of there, but when I reached the gate I had entered through, it was no longer there. The park had changed. The fences were gone. The streets were different. The entrance sign no longer said Dreamland Park. It was written in a language I didn't know. I turned around. The park looked brand new now. The rides were intact. The colors were vibrant. The food stands were lit up. But there was no one there. The sound of children's laughter filled the air. But I was still alone. The wind blew again, bringing the sweet, rotten smell. Then the lights on the Ferris wheel came on. They blinked in a strange pattern, almost as if they were forming words. That's when it hit me. This wasn't an abandoned park. It was a park stuck in time, and I had come to the wrong place. My eyes went to the carousel. The shadow was there again, but now it wasn't just one. There were more of them, many, distorted figures, standing around the carousel, watching me. Their bodies trembled, as if they were trapped between two worlds. Then they began to move. They came toward me. My feet locked. My brain screamed to run, but my body didn't respond. The closest one reached out her hand. Her fingers were too long and thin. That's when I heard a voice, a low, whispered voice coming from the park's loudspeaker. "You're the next visitor." The shadow touched my arm. Darkness swallowed me. I woke up with a bright sun beating down on my face. I was lying in the middle of the park. Dreamland Park was abandoned again. But something was different. I got up, still dizzy. My heart was pounding in my chest. I needed to get out of there. That's when I saw the sign again, and I realized what it said now. Welcome to Dreamland. Your fun will never end. Behind me, the carousel started spinning on its own again, and someone laughed. The first thing I noticed about the Beaumont Hotel in New Orleans was the smell, a mix of old wood, old perfume, and something metallic, the kind of smell that lingers in a place where time has stood still. I was in town for a news conference and needed a cheap place to stay. The Beaumont was old, but it had a certain charm. The hallways were narrow, the walls covered in faded wallpaper and gold chandeliers. The receptionist, a thin, pale man, handed me the key with a strange look. Room 616. I grabbed my suitcase and rode up in the ancient elevator. The iron doors creaked, and each floor seemed darker than the last. When I reached the 6th floor, I felt a chill. The hallway felt different. The carpet was a deep red, and the lights were dimmer. I walked to door 616 and unlocked it. The room was small, but comfortable. A double bed, a desk, an old TV. But what caught my attention the most was the lack of mirrors. Not even in the bathroom. I thought it was strange, but I ignored it. I closed the door, locked it, and threw myself on the bed. It was then that I heard a noise, something light, like a scratch. It came from the wall next to the headboard. I ran my hand over the wallpaper. There was a slight elevation, as if something was behind it. The noise stopped. My skin crawled. I ignored it and turned over to sleep. But then, I heard a whisper, low, faint, but clear enough to make me hold my breath. "Can you see me?" My body froze. The noise came again. Scratches. I slowly turned my head and saw something that made me swallow hard. The wallpaper moved, as if something was pressing down on the other side. My breath became short. My muscles locked. Then, the whisper came again. "You've been here before." The wallpaper began to tear on its own, and behind it, there was an eye, watching me. The eye blinked. My blood ran cold. Behind the torn wallpaper, something alive was watching me. Its dark, dilated pupils flickered in the darkness. Its gaze was fixed, deep, as if it recognized who I was. My breath caught in my chest. Instinct screamed to run, but my body wouldn't move. Then the voice whispered again, "You've been here before." The eye disappeared. The hole in the wallpaper was empty for a second. Then something began to move inside. My heart raced. There was a hidden space behind the wall. I squinted, trying to see better. The hole was too small, but the darkness seemed to ripple, as if someone were breathing on the other side. Then a finger poked through the hole, slender, white, long, dirty nails. I threw myself backward, falling off the bed. The wallpaper began to rip on its own. The sound of ripping fabric filled the room. My mind screamed, "Get out!" Zrania, but my legs were weak. The room seemed smaller, more suffocating. The lamplight flickered, and then the entire wall collapsed. Behind it was a second room. The floor was old wood, covered in a stained carpet. The smell was strong, sweet, and rotten. But the worst part was what was in the middle of the room. A rocking chair, and in it a woman sat. Gray skin, bones sticking out, long disheveled hair covering her face. She stood still, her thin hands gripping the arms of the chair. The light flickered again, and she was closer. A sob escaped my throat. She didn't move, but somehow she was closer. The voice whispered, "You should have never come back." My legs finally responded. I ran to the door. I turned the knob. Locked. I looked back. She was standing. The light went out. The darkness swallowed me. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. The silence was overwhelming. Then something cold touched my shoulder. The light came back on. The room was normal. No hole in the wall. No chair, no woman. My whole body was shaking. I grabbed my things and left as quickly as I could. The next day, I went back to the hotel. I needed answers. The receptionist looked at me strangely when I mentioned room 616. That room doesn't exist. My throat went dry. What do you mean? I slept in it. She frowned and handed me the registration book. My name was in it, but next to the room number, 616 was crossed out, and in its place, there was only one word written: red. I left without another word. I never returned to the Beaumont Hotel, but sometimes, when I look at the walls of my own room, I swear I see the wallpaper move, and I hear a whisper, "You should have never come back." The flea market was at the end of the road, far from the city center, hidden among gnarled oak trees and wooden huts. It was the kind of place where you find things forgotten by time. I wandered among the stalls, looking at old knickknacks, dusty clothes, and hardback books that looked like they had never been opened. Then I felt something strange. It was as if something was calling to me. My eyes were drawn to a dark corner of the market, where a small tent, covered in faded red fabric, hid from the others. The smell of old wood and mold was strong, and then I saw it. The doll. She sat on a shelf, wearing a blue lace dress that had yellowed with age. Her blonde hair was dull and tangled, and the porcelain of her face was slightly cracked. But the worst were her eyes. Big, bright, coal black. My chest tightened. I've never liked antique dolls. There's something wrong with them. "Do you like her?" The voice came from behind the counter, an elderly woman with wrinkled skin and sunken eyes. "She's antique, very antique." My first instinct was to refuse, but my fingers were already touching the doll. The contact with the cold porcelain made me shiver. She seemed too cold for such a hot day. "I'll take her." The words escaped my mouth before I could think better of it. The woman smiled, taking a piece of red fabric and wrapping the doll carefully. Before handing it to me, she whispered something that sent chills down my spine. "Don't take the fabric off at night." I swallowed hard, nodded, paid, and left. But that night, I regretted not having heeded the warning. I placed the doll on the shelf in my room, still wrapped in the red fabric. I felt a strange relief at not having to look directly into those eyes. Sleep came quickly. The silence of the house was comforting, until the moment I woke up. Something was wrong. I opened my eyes and looked around. The room was dark, only a small beam of streetlight coming through the window. Everything seemed normal, until I heard a sound, a light scratching. It was coming from the shelf. I swallowed hard and slowly turned to look. The red cloth bundle was on the floor. My mouth went dry. I was sure the doll had been positioned correctly before I fell asleep. Then the darkness grew deeper, and a faint sound echoed through the room. A laugh. My whole body shivered. The sound was low, childish, but it carried something wrong. I blinked, trying to adjust my vision to the darkness. Then I saw it. The doll was sitting on the carpet, facing directly at me. The red cloth bundle lay beside her, unraveled. Someone, or something, had removed the cloth. My breath caught. I hadn't put her there. Then the glass eyes glowed for a moment, and I heard it. A husky, childish voice whispering, "Now we can play. Now we can play." The whisper echoed through the room like a cold wind. My body froze. The doll's glass eyes seemed deeper, more alive. My breath caught in my chest. That thing was sitting on the floor, alone. And the worst part? The red cloth was beside her, undone. That damn doll moved on its own. I closed my eyes for a second. This isn't happening. When I opened them again, she was still there. But now, closer to my bed, my heart beat so hard I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. I jumped up, turned on the light, and picked up the doll with shaking hands. She seemed heavier. The glass of her eyes reflected the light in a strange way, as if there was something inside. "What the hell are you?" Silence. The whole house was silent. No noise from the street, no wind, nothing. I clutched the doll tighter. I had to get rid of it. I ran to the kitchen. I threw the thing in the trash can, closed the lid, and pulled the bag over to tie it. My heart was pounding in my chest, but just as I finished tying the bag, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Small, quick footsteps. My stomach turned. My body went cold. No, I'm alone. I'm alone. I grabbed a knife from the drawer and turned slowly. The hallway was dark, but I knew it wasn't empty. The smell of old wood and mold filled the air. "You can't throw me away." The whisper came from too close, behind me. My body froze. Something was watching me in the dark. A shiver ran down my spine. I turned around on impulse, raising the knife, but the hallway was empty. I looked at the trash can. The bag was still there, tied up. She was in there, or she should have been. I approached slowly, the knife steady in my hand. My breath was short. I picked up the trash bag and opened it. It was empty. The doll was gone. My lungs seized up. How? A cracking sound came from the room, like furniture being dragged. I swallowed hard. My hands were sweating. I didn't want to go back there, but something was pulling me. Step by step, I entered the room. And then, my blood ran cold. The doll was back, sitting on my bed, now, with her head slightly tilted, as if she was smiling. My body refused to move. I knew what I had to do. I grabbed the doll and ran to the backyard. My feet were barely touching the ground. I threw the thing into the barbecue and lit a match. The flame spread across the faded blue dress. The smell of burning mixed with mold was unbearable. The doll cracked, and then I heard it, a scream, loud, high-pitched, coming from inside her. The fire crackled and the porcelain shattered. The scream stopped. The air felt lighter. Silence returned, but I knew it wasn't over. The next morning, I went back to the flea market. The old lady's stall was gone. I asked a few vendors, but no one remembered her, or the doll. But before I left, something caught my eye. At the back of the market, on a shelf, there was another doll, blue dress, glass eyes, watching me, waiting for a new owner. I should never have taken that job. As a journalism intern, my job was to cover small stories in forgotten rural towns, ordinary things like fairs, festivals, or urban legends. But when I got the assignment about the abandoned house in Hollow Creek, something felt different. The locals refused to talk about it. They said no one had lived there for more than 50 years. But every night, someone screamed inside the house, and no one knew who. I arrived in town just before sunset. The sky was gray and heavy, and the cold wind blew through the trees. The house was at the end of a dirt road, isolated from the others. It was a large building, made of dark wood, with broken windows and a sloping roof that seemed to weigh itself down. But the worst part was the door. It was open, as if it had been waiting for me. I swallowed hard and walked across the yard covered in dry leaves. The smell of rotting wood filled the air. I climbed the steps to the porch and slowly pushed open the door. The interior was frozen in time. The furniture was covered in dust. The pictures were crooked on the walls, and a dark rug was torn in the middle of the room. The silence was absolute, but I could feel something inside, something waiting. I turned on my flashlight and went upstairs. The banister was sticky, as if something had been dripping down it. The hallway upstairs was even worse. The bedroom doors were open, except for one, the last door on the right. I approached slowly, feeling my chest tighten. The air was colder here, heavier. I touched the doorknob, cold. I pushed open the door. The room was empty, except for the bed in the middle. The sheets were messed up, as if someone had just left, and on the wall above the headboard, handprints, small, deep, like someone had grabbed onto them, struggling to keep from being pulled into the wall. My throat went dry. I took a step back. That's when I heard it, a scream, loud, coming from inside the wall. The scream came from inside the wall, high-pitched, desperate, human. The sound went through me like a cold blade. My muscles locked up. I couldn't move. Then the flashlights flickered, and for a second, the wall moved. It was subtle, but I saw it, like something was pressing against the other side, trying to get out. The scream grew louder. My heart hammered in my chest. This couldn't be possible. It was all in my head. It had to be. But then, the handprints on the wall began to deepen, as if invisible fingers were scratching at the wood. The air grew thicker. The smell of mold and rotting flesh filled my nostrils. And then, the pounding began. Bam, bam, bam. Something on the other side of the wall was trying to get out. My instincts screamed to run, but my feet wouldn't respond. That's when I saw it. A crack opened in the wall, and for an instant, I saw an eye, a human eye, wide, filled with terror. It saw me and blinked. That was enough to make me react. I spun on my heel and ran. My feet stumbled on the steps as I descended the stairs. The screaming continued. Now it was more than one. Several voices, men, women, children, all screaming at once. I ran to the front door and pulled on the handle, locked. I looked around, my heart pounding. The windows were boarded up with old boards. Behind me, the screaming grew louder. Then the sound changed. Now it was whispers. Help us. They've locked us in here. They're coming. Cold sweat trickled down the back of my neck. I had to get out of here. I ran to the kitchen and pulled out the nearest drawer. I found an old, rusty knife. I went back into the hallway. The pounding on the wall was louder. Bam, bam, bam. The voices were crying. I grabbed the knife and forced the blade into the crack in the wall. The wood was old and weak. It began to give way. Then I heard a sound behind me. Footsteps. Someone was upstairs. My eyes went up to the top of the stairs, and there, standing in the hallway, was a man, tall, thin, wearing an old black suit. His face was covered in shadows, but his eyes, they were sunken and empty. He didn't move. He just watched me. The knife blade trembled in my hand. I couldn't stop now. I shoved the knife into the crack again and pulled. The wood gave way. A hole opened, and from inside it, a pale hand emerged, skinny, fragile, trembling. The fingers clawed at the edge of the wall, trying to hold on. Then I saw a face, a woman, her eyes wide, her mouth open in a silent scream. But before she could get out, something pulled her back, something big, something I didn't see. The darkness inside the wall swallowed the woman whole, and then the hole closed on its own. Silence filled the house. I turned around slowly. The man at the top of the stairs was still there, but now he was smiling. "You shouldn't have opened it." The voice didn't come from his mouth. It came from the walls. The ground beneath my feet began to shake. The walls vibrated. The screams returned. There were hundreds of them now. The man took a step forward. "Now you belong to the house too." The front door flew open. The wind blew violently inside. I didn't think. I ran, crossing the yard, stumbling on the dry earth, fleeing from that damned house. The screams followed me until I passed through the gate, and then the silence returned. I turned to look one last time. The house was as before, still, dark, waiting. But now, in the upstairs window, the man was still there, smiling, because he knew. I took the house with me, and sooner or later, I would return.